Good morning. Kearsarge Valley is how I get from my house to the church every day. So I've seen the Marshall stuff kind of get moved around. And I can point the house out to you if you want to drop off yellow squash, cucumbers, if you want to hide in the woods with a clown mask on. Just a thought. As we get to Halloween and whatnot. Oh. Well, if you are a sports fan, and I understand that not everyone is, chances are your loyalties supersede like anywhere that you might live. We've moved around a bit, obviously, but I'll always be an Ohio sports fan. So like I can get behind the Sox, probably can get behind the Celtics. The Patriots isn't going to happen until Belichick's gone. But I'm always going to be a Bengals, Browns, Reds, Guardians, even though that's a dumb name, and Cavaliers in the NBA, above anyone else. So there was this time when LeBron James came to Dallas, and I thought it would be really cool to take the family to go see him play in person. Cavaliers, Mavericks, it was Cavs, Mavs. I had this vision in my head, okay, of like how this was going to go. We were going to get there super early. We'd all be wearing Cavs gear. It's not a big deal because it's not Beirut or, worse, Philadelphia. But we'd stand out, okay? And so in my head, LeBron would see us, and he'd see us in the gear, and he'd see our young kids in the gear, and he would say, "Oh, I would love to give you an autograph and come down, and you know what, I'll hold your youngest and we can have a picture." This was what was going on in my head. None of that happened. We did get there early. We did wear the gear. So were hundreds of other people. And whatever spot, you could possibly gather in order to get autographs, that was already full. So that wasn't going to happen. Still, we saw him play. It was really fun. And we had really good seats. Like, I don't know if you've ever been to the Garden, but all of these places are pretty much built the same. There's a lower level, there's an upper level. We had the top row, like we were sitting at the top row of the lower level. What surprised me, though, was after we bought the tickets, but before the game, I got a call from the Mavericks. It's a weird thing, to look down at your phone and see Dallas Mavericks. I thought, what is this about? Like, do they need a chaplain? No, they did not. But it was someone asking me if I knew where to go. Like, did I have any questions? And I thought, that's polite and weird. Like, I've been to my share of sporting events, baseball games and whatnot. I've never received a call like this before. And then, after the game, they called back. Same guy. How'd you like the evening? Was there anything we could have done to make your experience more enjoyable? I thought, you could turn the volume down. That stuff gets kind of loud. But then he said, might you be interested in season ticket packages? And it hit me. He thinks we have money. You might not know this, okay? NBA ticket prices change based on the opponent. So it's more expensive to go see a game against somebody that's good versus someone who's at the bottom of, the standings. It's more expensive to see superstars than it is a bunch of nobodies. This was LeBron. These were good seats. Like, to me, this was a once-in-a-lifetime kind of purchase. To the Mavs, it was, may we interest you in something more? No, you may not. Eventually, the calls stopped. We all know, okay, how the world works. Generally speaking, people treat you differently based on what they think you can do for them. We don't like it, but it kind of is. Firms take potential clients out for meals. If it's a really important client, it might be a really nice meal. Donate enough to a school, to a candidate, to a ministry, and you will receive treatment the average individual just wouldn't merit. It's why big nonprofits have development departments and donor relation teams, because if someone they know, if they enjoy the giving experience, if they're treated right, chances are they're going to do it again. And maybe they'll even give more than they did the first time. Okay, that was weird. I've never in 17 years done that. Sneeze during a message, not just sneeze in general. Okay. This is so much fun. This whole culture, okay, of giving and how you're treated and, you know, what can you do for me? It feels kind of icky because it says to the person on the giving end, you don't so much care about me. You're really just interested in what I can do for you. I don't know if it would surprise you to learn that Jesus wasn't crazy about that either. This morning, we are at the end of John chapter 4, specifically verse 43 to 54. Some stuff's happened, okay, between his turning water into wine at the end of chapter, or the beginning of chapter 2 that we looked at last week, and this scene that we're studying today. Right after Cana, in terms of how John puts together his gospel, he gives us something that happens at the end of Jesus' ministry, the turning over of the tables in the temple, like where he gets really mad at the money changers. He's doing that so he can show you, here's what Jesus' ministry was like at the beginning, and here's what it was like at the end. And then in chapters 3 and 4, he juxtaposes these two conversations that Jesus has with individual people. Nicodemus in chapter 3 and the woman at the well in chapter 4. He puts them right next to each other because Nicodemus is this guy. He is a Pharisee. He's part of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. So based on his education, based on his experience, his lineage, his upbringing, he should grasp, it should be obvious to him that this is the Messiah. But he doesn't get it. He can't see past his own questions. Then you have the woman at the well, okay? She is a Samaritan. In Israel's eyes, they were not the chosen people. They were half Jewish, half Assyrian, like religious muggles, if that helps. Those in the south, on the other hand, the descendants of Judah, they were the purebloods, the real deal. They worshipped at the grounds where Solomon's temple once stood, not whatever the Samaritans had constructed on Mount Gerizim. So this woman, you've got the Samaritan, she's not really a Jew. She's a woman, so she's not really a person in the sense that a man was. And then you've got her dating life. I mean, my goodness, married and divorced 5 times. Now she's just living with some dude. But Jesus talked to her. And he revealed himself to her. And she believed. Someone who had no business understanding or recognizing the Messiah from a Jewish point of view, understood it fully enough, okay, to have been with Jesus, and then she hightails it back to her town so that she can tell everyone that she met, that she just met, the one who said to her, I who speak to you am he. She's going to stand out. She is placed where she is in the gospel, right next to Nicodemus, because she is the opposite of what Jesus is increasingly experiencing. People whose belief is less dependent upon him and more so on what people believe he can do for them. Remember, belief for John is a verb. It's a process. And so he will record people going from belief to unbelief, or maybe from unbelief back to belief, and they never really get to what we would call saving faith. It stays superficial. It doesn't get below the surface. John will mention this, okay, at the end of chapter 6, at the end of 12, and Jesus mentions it here in our passage for this morning at the end of 4. What it leads us to ask, what I want you to think about, okay, when it comes to our faith, how can we move beyond the superficial to something more meaningful? So if you haven't yet, please turn to John 4. I'm going to start reading in verse 43. It says, after the 2 days, he went forth from there into Galilee. We're parachuting into this passage. So because of that, it might be a little bit confusing. What do you mean 2 days? Like 2 days from what? And where is the where from which he, being Jesus, went forth? The 2 days is explained in verse 40. It says, so that when the Samaritans came to Jesus, they were asking him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. Jesus had gone to Samaria on purpose, which would have been unusual for a Jewish person. He'd met with the woman at the well, which would have been unusual for a Jewish man. She goes back and tells her whole world. They ask if he'd consider staying a couple of extra days so they could see for themselves. And that's very unusual for someone who's considered to be a rabbi, a teacher, who has students or disciples or followers. An untold number end up believing in him. So after those 2 days, he went down, or rather to Galilee. Verse 44 tells us why. For Jesus himself testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. This is given to us as why Jesus goes into Galilee. And it can make you think, what does this mean? I think we get the saying, okay, that people who know you best sometimes believe in you the least. But what does he mean by his own country? The word literally means homeland, and I think he's talking about Israel as a whole, and specifically Galilee, because Nazareth is in Galilee. Jesus was a Galilean. So he goes to Galilee where people don't like him too much. Look at verse 45. So when he came to Galilee, the Galileans received him. That doesn't sound bad. Having seen all the things that he did in Jerusalem at the feast, for they themselves also went to the feast. That doesn't really sound like they're not honoring him, unless it isn't so much about him as what he can do for them. They received him because they'd seen what he'd done at the feast. What feast? If you turn back to chapter 2, specifically 23 through 25, it says, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name, observing the signs which he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, was not entrusting himself to them, for he knew all men, and because he did not need anyone to testify concerning him, for he himself knew what was in man. He got the idea. He knew what was going on in their hearts, that even though they were demonstrating belief, that it was because of what they'd seen him do. That it wasn't about him, it was about what he might be able to do for them. It is a superficial faith. One person you can imagine saying to another, you won't believe what this guy can do. More superficial rather than meaningful. So if you go back to chapter 4, okay, and I think this view of the people, this being the nature of their faith, is confirmed by the beginning of the encounter that starts in 46. Therefore, he came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And there was a royal official whose son was sick at Capernaum. So Jesus had been in Cana. John thinks this is enough of a big deal that he wants everyone to know that this was where he turned the water into wine. Remember that? It was really cool. This is the same place. There's this royal official from Capernaum. His son is sick. 47. When he heard that Jesus had come out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and was imploring him to come down and heal his son. Why? Because he was at the point of death. And just so we're clear, this is not a Roman. It says royal official, and we can think, oh, he's a Roman. He's not. He's a Jewish man. He is an assistant, if you will, in the administration of Herod Antipas, who was this Jewish puppet king that the Romans had installed to make things more orderly so they'd have to focus on everything that they wanted to focus on. His son isn't just sick, okay? He's really sick. He's at the point of death. It makes sense then that the official doesn't just ask once. When it says imploring in 47, that is a verb that is in what's called the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense is something that happened in the past continually. So he is asking Jesus again and again and again, please do something. Please, please, please. And this is the Lord's response, 48. So Jesus said to him, unless you people see signs and wonders, you simply will not believe. Kind of feels like he's had a bad day. And maybe he didn't need one more person treating him like some kind of spiritual vending machine. When it comes to our faith, how can we move beyond the superficial to something more meaningful? I have two thoughts just from these first several verses. I think first, it means admit that a superficial faith is something we've all had. Okay? Admit that a superficial faith is something we've all had. We are this guy. Okay, the Israelites of Jesus' day, whether we're talking about Galileans, Judeans, Nazarenes, anyone and everyone with whom the Lord came into contact, they're not that different from us. Okay? They wore different clothes. They had access to different technologies. But at the end of the day, people are people. We think of God as the source of good things, and we should. Okay, James 1:17, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. But do we want a relationship with him, or do we simply want what we might gain from that relationship? And I'm not sure if the answer is always clear or if the categories are like that cut and dry. Like, I know God has the ability, okay, to heal my wife. I know that he can. I know that I'm supposed to present my requests to God, and so I do. A lot, okay? The question is my desire to follow him dependent on his answer? I hope not. But I can't just tell you that that's always been the case. Okay, how many of us have ever said, if you grant my request, then I will give you my whole life? It happens, okay? We're not always people of substance. We have to guard against thinking in terms of them as opposed to us, where we aren't them or those people. Not a good place to be, okay? And so one of the steps towards a faith that is more meaningful is admitting that sometimes this official is us. That sometimes we do this. That we think more about what Jesus can do for us than just simply following him. If that's where I am, it's a step away from where I want my heart to be and towards something that I really don't want to be true. Secondly, though, this is very comforting, I think it means believe that the God of the Bible has a patience that surpasses all understanding. So admit that a superficial faith is something we've all had. Believe that the God of the Bible is patient beyond all understanding. Verse 49. The royal official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Which I think is a reasonable response to what appears to be exasperation on Jesus' part. "Sir, I don't know anything about those people. I'm not looking to be entertained. This is my child. I don't know if you noticed the word switch. That John refers to the sick one as his son twice. In the Greek language, there are a number of words for offspring. Son can be a child. Son can be a grown man. This is a different word. That's why it says child. Check the word for a young child, one that hasn't reached puberty yet, and it's more personal. The sense is that Jesus has said, unless you people see miracles, you won't believe. And the official comes back with, sir, my baby's about to die. Please do something. And we know that sometimes it doesn't matter how old your child gets, they will still forever be your baby. But this is his baby. This is a young child. And he is in trouble. And Jesus doesn't hesitate. Jesus said to him, this is the first part of verse 50, go, your son lives. Didn't matter the kind of day that the Lord had. Didn't matter that the very people waiting for the Messiah only seemed to view Jesus as a magic act. Christ met this man where he was. He took his faith for what it was, which based on what I think it says a little bit later on here, when they start talking to each other, it's non-existent. But still, Jesus healed his son. The man said, my baby's dying, and Jesus changed the outcome. You can call that compassion. You can call it mercy. I agree. But what I think sums this up is it's an expression of patience. And what I want you to understand, that it is all a deliberate choice. Okay? You have to know that I am a firm believer in the absolute, unequivocal aseity of God. Aseity of God. It's a new word, I know. Aseity means the Lord is self-existent, self-sufficient, and free. Another way to say it would be that he's independent of anything and everything in existence. And if you're wondering why I didn't just say independent, ask doctors why they say edema when they could just as easily say swelling. Okay? It's a thing. God is uncaused. He is uncreated. He has always existed, and his existence doesn't depend on anything or anyone. He doesn't need air. He doesn't need water. He doesn't need health care. He will always be, okay? Similarly, whenever he feels something, it's because he chose to, not because someone or something made him feel that way. That's not us. Believe me, I so wish it was. I would love to decide whether or not I felt something. That would be an incredible superpower, to be in complete control of your emotions, but we aren't God. Jesus is. So that's both good, like in general, and really good for us. I've said this before, but it bears repeating. It means you won't ever be the last straw with the Lord. He won't ever have had such a bad day, okay, that your struggle is what happens to send him over the edge. Like where he just can't take it anymore. You're the one who gets to pay the price. It also means that when he does have an emotion like love, it's because he chooses to. When he shows love, it's because he wants to, not because he's overcome with sentiment or he heard like a sad song on the radio. It's kind of like when your mom says you look good. You don't take that the same. Why? Because she has to say that. She's contractually obligated to say that. Someone else says it, you're like, oh yeah, okay. It's amazing. Mom and dad can say the same thing over and over again. Someone else comes along, says that exact same thing. And the child says, oh, now I get it. With this royal official, okay, the superficiality of practically everyone's faith that Jesus had encountered up to this point, it didn't keep him from intervening. And that's not just fortunate, that's predictable. Not that he always heals, we know that he doesn't. What's predictable is that the behavior of others isn't going to determine how God responds to you. You don't have to worry about that, okay? Moving beyond the superficial to something more meaningful, I think it involves an accurate grasp of the character of God, okay? So believe that he has a patience beyond all understanding, because he does. And that does God show disappointment? Yes. Anger? Absolutely. God is an emotional being. That's why you have emotions. We have been created in his image. You reflect him. The difference is he's always in control of his emotions. He's always the one who decides when, for how long, and how intensely he feels something. What we see in this encounter, okay, is that his patience is on full display. He says what's true. What he's mostly encountered up to this point has been a superficial faith. People seem to only be interested in what he can do, but he's patient. And we will see it far more than once. God is okay with where you are, but he loves you too much to leave you there. He pulls, he nudges, he encourages. Sometimes he drags, and sometimes he will shove because he knows where you need to be. We matter that much to him, otherwise it would just be a waste of time. And why waste the time? So what happens next, okay, absolutely astounds me. It really does. As someone whose baby has been ill with a life-threatening disease, this is nothing short of shocking. Take a look at the second half of verse 50. Jesus said to him, "Go, your son lives." The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and started off. Just Jesus said it, and he left. Like, what? He doesn't know Jesus. He's heard what Jesus has done, but there wasn't any kind of explanation. There was no, like, here's why you can trust me. Simply 4 words: go, your son lives. The man just believed him. He took those words at face value and left. Go, your son lives. Okay, I'll go. Like, if you were the royal official, wouldn't you have felt more comfortable if Jesus had gone with you? I mean, what if this was an atypical case of whatever, and it required Jesus to be physically present, like to lay hands on or something on the child? I wouldn't have known how it works if I'm this guy. You can say, yeah, it's Jesus. He doesn't have to be present to do something. This guy doesn't know that. He doesn't know anything. He's just heard what's happened before. My point is, as far as the official is concerned, okay, he's taking a considerable risk. Cana and Capernaum were 25 miles apart. 25 miles. Have you ever seen The Fugitive? Okay, Tommy Lee Jones, Harrison Ford. But in the beginning, we learn from Tommy Lee Jones that the average human foot speed over uneven ground, barring injury, is 4 miles an hour. To move at 4 miles an hour is hoofing it, okay? And if you've been told that your baby is sick but now is well, you might hoof it, okay? But can you hoof it for 7 straight hours? Like, we're going to see in a minute that this happens at 1 o'clock. You don't travel at night. It's very dangerous to do that. So chances are you had to stay the night someplace and then move on the next day. This is a risk. Like, what if he gets home and finds out nothing has happened? Is he going to have time to walk back? How is he going to know where Jesus is? Like, leaving the Lord behind was a risk. I mean, yes, leaving his son's side anyway was a risk. If you knew your child was in their last hours, would you want to leave them by? Would you want to leave their side? From a human point of view, folks, there was a downside to leaving Jesus and simply walking home. Was it worth it? 100%. Like trusting Jesus always is. Verse 51. Now, as he was going down, because going from Cana to Capernaum is an altitude change, his slaves met him, saying that his son was living. Like, your son's okay. So he inquired of them the hour when he began to get better. And they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, 1 o'clock. And the fever left him. The fever left him. What's the result? So the father knew that it was at that hour in which Jesus said to him, your son lives. And he himself believed, and his whole household. So you have this statement about belief in verse 50, but it's there again in 53. I think because there is growth in this man's faith. It is maturing. It's beyond just what Jesus can do for him, and it's in Jesus himself. It's moving beyond the superficial to something more meaningful, and what that took was a risk. Why his whole household? I mean, in one sense, it's because it's a patriarchal society. So if dad comes home and says, okay, family, we are now going to believe this, the family would have said, okay. But I really think it's more than that. I think they saw what Jesus did, and it was a wow moment. This is what God uses to mature our faith. We don't usually call it a risk. Okay, we use words like step of faith, but it's the same idea. Okay, I'm using the word risk on purpose because I think we understand that it's associated with cost. Like where we might lose something or have to forego something else. And that's where faith is matured. You can't forge steel without fire. I don't know how our faith can get any stronger than it is if we're never risking anything for Christ. Like, how do we move beyond the superficial to something more meaningful? Admit that a superficial faith is something we've all had. Believe that the God of the Bible is patient beyond all understanding. And finally, commit to a faith that takes risks for Christ. Commit to a faith that takes risks for Christ. Nothing out there gets healthy by not doing anything. And if you've ever seen the movie Wall-E, that's what happens when we never lift a finger. What I'm saying is that consistent inactivity never leads to anything good. It's a principle that's true whether we're talking about work, relationships, money, health, all of it. Spirituality isn't any different. You simply aren't going to experience any real growth in your faith if you don't do anything with it. The royal official is an example of a risk. But because we're talking about Jesus, it's a risk worth taking. It's a risk worth taking. What we typically do in our lives, okay, is we engineer some sort of safety net. Where if God doesn't come through like we were hoping, it's a bummer, but it'll be okay. And it's not a universal bad. I mean, Jesus told us to count the cost, for sure. But I think we do have to ask ourselves the question, where in our lives are we trusting Jesus? Where in our lives are we trusting Jesus? Where are we taking a risk for Christ? This doesn't have to be earth-shattering stuff, folks. Okay, I don't want anyone going up to a cliff and saying, for Jesus! All right? Faith Bible, or Trinity Bible Church is not responsible should anything happen. Okay. I think you're taking a risk whenever you set aside time to read God's Word and pray. Because you could be using that time to do other stuff that you know is visibly productive. Instead, you're trusting the Lord that the Bible isn't just a book. You're trusting the Lord that your prayers aren't simply words being spoken into thin air. You're risking what you could have done with your time. If you're giving, okay, that's a risk. Because if church isn't anything more than like a glorified social club or book club, then certainly there's better things you could be doing with your money. And you're probably foregoing something that you could own or be doing. And so that is a risk. Not to shamelessly promote, but I'm going to shamelessly promote. If you're all in with us on this each one have one deal, where you're spending time with Christ each day, adjusting your schedule to find a place to connect, find a place to serve. If you're praying to have a spiritual conversation with someone who doesn't know Jesus, those are all risks. Because like if God answers that prayer, and I believe that He will, that's scary stuff. That can feel like cliff jumping. Like if you want to move your family from Pennsylvania to New Hampshire, like the Marshalls, great. If you want to move your family from Texas to New Hampshire, great. Sometimes it is really big stuff. But sometimes it is as simple as asking someone, what do you believe happens after you die? What if you were to look at someone and should you go to a restaurant? What if you look at the person at Dunkin' who's processing your order and you say something along the lines of, is there anything I could pray for you about? That's a risk. That's scary stuff. But imagine what God can do with that. Folks, here is my encouragement to you. Have a conversation about this. Like, why in our small groups are we focusing on these texts? Because I want conversations to happen about this stuff. But besides that, just today, on the way home, as you're eating, before you go to bed, where in our lives are we trusting Jesus? Just ask the question. See what God does. Because what I am sure of, it is as certain as I am that there is a God, that He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. And so He is taking you from wherever your faith is. It doesn't have to be superficial, but wherever it is, He's taking it to something more meaningful. That's what He's doing with all of us. What I'd rather do is join Him in that than try to resist. Where in our lives are we trusting Jesus? Let's pray. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for your word, for this man, for his son, for the conversation that I'm sure happened when he got home. And I pray that this would characterize all of our relationships with you, that we would be in a place where we are trusting you with more and more. More of ourselves, more of our actions, more of our thoughts. That God, we are dependent upon you. That we would live that way. That others would see us live that way. And I pray that you would use all these things to change individual lives, to change entire households. But most importantly, Lord, that you will be glorified. That your name will be made great from all this. As you did with this man, you are doing with us. You are showing us who you are, that the world might believe. In Christ's name, amen. Please stand.